Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to make sure, that I have control over my PowerPoint. It's wonderful to be back in Ireland and to be back at UCC again. I'm a big fan of the law school here and of the hands-on philosophy. We have that same philosophy at the law school in Montana, and we are developing a relationship with the law school here. So it's a privilege to be with you. So I have three parts to the presentation. First is the sustainability principle, which we all talk a lot about and debate about. The contours are not fully defined, but I'll offer a definition, a working definition. Then I take a look at the current energy picture, primarily focusing on the U.S., since that's my responsibility and my responsibility to seek to improve. Then looking at government policy and the importance of government policy to the issue of climate change and the environment in general. Then something a little different here, I look at comparative incentives and the problem of conversation stoppers. And on this point, if there's time, I'd like for us to start the conversation to try to battle and push back on conversation stoppers. So first, the sustainability principle. Everyone here is familiar with it. I give some examples. First, these are not the earliest or the latest examples, just some noteworthy ones. The 1987 report, Our Common Future, did a great deal to mobilize concern about the environment. The Earth Summit, the first one in Rio in '92, similarly had great advertising and great interest in what would happen. Same with the Convention on Biological Diversity. But many are disappointed with the results, or some might say the lack of results, which brings me to back again to a continuing theme, the need for governance on this issue. Perhaps not an issue that we can simply proclaim and all depend on everyone marching toward the good. So sustainability, as we heard this morning, is acknowledged but not given as a right. I offer the example of the Constitution of Montana as one articulation and, in fact, coming close to a right. I expect that everyone here knows the federal government in the United States has failed to create an actual right to a clean environment, but some states do proclaim such a right. So as a matter of action against a state, you would expect that you would have more of an enforceable ability as a citizen of that state. That point, however, is left in some uncertainty with regard to enforcement, a topic that we discussed this morning. So this is one of my favorite pronouncements in the Constitution of Montana, the very first sentence. We, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution. What I like about that, well, it's almost poetry, but it situates the law in an area that acknowledges our dependence for beauty and sustenance on the physical environment. So at the very beginning of pronouncement of constitutional rights, we acknowledge the beauty of the state the vastness of the physical properties we've been given. Then the Constitution goes on to tie this into one of the issues we debated, and that is it utilitarian, or is it right to the environment or right of the environment? Someone this morning was discussing. And this pretty firmly grounds us in a utilitarian principle rather than proclaiming the rights of the environment, grounds it in the rights of quality of life for humans. Now, some of us would say, well, that leaves out the eagle and the tiger from this morning's discussion, and in a sense it does. But I do think that the practicality of this is that it grounds the environment as a need of people, a need of society. And this was really part of the discussion in this morning's conference as well, that perhaps this is our best shot at protection, of saying we need to protect the environment for our quality of life and for future generations as well. So this goes a step further than any federal law, and several states have, either as a matter of constitution or as a matter of statutory right, a declaration of a right to the environment. And furthermore, a right to a healthful environment. The Montana Constitution does one further pronouncement of rights, saying that all persons are born free and have inalienable rights, and this includes the right to a clean and healthful environment. As I noted earlier, there is still some debate regarding standing to bring this right. So is it aspirational? Is it practical and enforceable? This is one step further than we would have without the Constitution, but it doesn't make it as clear-cut as it could be. Some constitutional cases in Montana do say that there is a right of enforcement. Not entirely settled, however. So sustainability. People often say, well, this is a indeterminate and vague concept, but certainly we can have bookends of what it means and what it doesn't mean. I've even heard developers note that, well, it really means sustaining development. No, I would protest. It does at least mean trying to sustain what we have in terms of healthful environment. So this is a working definition from the UN to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, that was not a problem until recent times. The carrying capacity of the Earth is now challenged by our own success, by the fact that the proliferation of people has been as successful as it has been, means that we are in fear of using up rather than simply using. To young children, we say, keep the campsite as you found it. Use it, enjoy it, but don't use it up. I think that's a good way to express the fundamental principle of sustainable development. Some pessimists say it's already too late, particularly in the climate change area, but not only in the climate change area. Hawken has said it's not really a matter of sustaining because we are so far down the road toward using it up that really what we need to do is restore and then sustain. Some of the environmental canon of the United States seems to acknowledge that point as well. The Clean Water Act talks about restoring the cleanliness of water and then maintaining that cleanliness. Other doomsday sayers say that we're really into declining energy from fossil fuel at this point anyway, and also claims that carbon dioxide and worldwide energy consumption have hit a point where we are in a downward spiral. I think that even though there is debate on these points, what should we do? We can only do what we think is the best to try to restore and maintain, since it makes no sense simply to give up or have a hedonistic approach based on the idea that every society should do its best. Surely we wouldn't, even if we have a fear that doomsayers are right, we wouldn't simply give up and use it all up. It's a similar debate on climate change. Some say it's too late already, and there's been a lot of debate, of course, about whether or not the cause of climate change is anthropomorphic. Some saying, well, this is a natural cycle, and I would sort of come to the bottom line again that causation is always difficult. We don't, even if we say we don't know precisely the cause, the only thing we can do anything about are man-made changes, and so why wouldn't we try to do our best on that? The debate between adaptation and mitigation goes on. I don't know why I put them in that order. I guess because watching the U.S. Congress jump from first we're not sure there's a problem, then a big leap toward, well, we need to adapt. Very little energy spent, human energy spent on the mitigation phase. So I think we need to try to give dual consideration and try to implement both mitigation and adaptation on a dual track, because it simply gives us the best bet at controlling, trying to restore and maintain, and to push back against the problem. If it is too late, we won't know till later, and so my point is, do the best that you can. So that takes us up to current energy picture and the question, have we done the best that we can, and can we do better in the future? The staggering and depressing fact is that the U.S. citizens use 5.5 times the greenhouse gas average of other parts of the world. I didn't work out the average in Ireland, but I'm expecting we're worse at any rate. And you know, the debate on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change really doesn't address the further point that let's assume maybe the concerns are overblown, that perhaps the greenhouse effect is really not as dire as we are concerned with. Still, we have impacts on human health from toxins associated with carbon and with fossil fuels. So that has an independent reason for trying to address that problem. As we saw this morning, at the center of development, any kind of development, is energy. We cannot function without energy. We couldn't be in this lovely environment, business environment that we find ourselves without energy production and use. But of course, the debate should not be on whether or not to use energy, but rather first how to generate it, how to produce it, how to distribute it, and how to use it wisely. Those are all topics that demand our attention. Cutting energy use seems increasingly unlikely, although all of us try to do that as well. So that brings me to the need for government. If we simply try to appeal to each person's moral requirement to do the best he or she can do, that's very admirable, but we've seen from the tragedy of the commons, individual interest, and really the futility of being the only individual doing something. It shows us that group effort is really needed. And that's come to be called often mutual coercion mutually agreed to. Mutual coercion mutually agreed to is really a long term for the law. So we find our hope in the law in this regard because of the gravity of the situation. So we need to look to proven technologies other than fossil fuel. Pretty clearly we cannot walk away from fossil fuel entirely, but we do know that energy sources are vast and exist in other venues other than simply fossil fuel. Solar is considered by lenders now a proven technology, as is wind, as is wave resources. The number of innovative energy sources really continues to build. One that's being investigated now, I'd be interested in a show of hands of how many of you have heard of this, is in a desert, simply well, it's called the Tower of Power, which is mostly a greenhouse, but with fans that are generated as the hot air goes up. It's a promising technology, very little infrastructure. The other one that's on I'd like to see, well, let me give you the other one, the next one that has had some interest in the investment community, and that is simply pumping water to high levels during low demand energy times. That serves as storage, and then releasing the water, creating hydropower during times of peak demand. How many of you have heard of those innovative technologies? Oh, great. And you know, the list goes on and on. A student of mine a couple of years ago playing on the movie There Will Be Blood, which is a movie with Daniel Day-Lewis, a very good movie about the oil boom. And so the student's paper was There Will Be Biofuels, speaking to the maybe provocative idea that biofuels are inevitable. I'll circle back to that idea. We're not necessarily biofuels, but innovative, renewable energy. Let's think of it as inevitable. So rejecting the idea that we can individually seek promises without coercion, I'll turn to potential government responses. And these are pretty general. I bet you've heard of all of them. The cap and trade response, auctioned rights for greenhouse gas, and direct taxation of carbon emissions, and then technological controls. So all of these have potential, and each has interest generated. None has captured the consciousness of the U.S., and none has dominated the world market in any way. Probably the most direct and easy to implement would be a carbon tax. There is not much support for that, however. Business community feeling that it's an unfair burden to tax them directly. Nevertheless, for a problem of this magnitude, I think we recognize that the government has to have a role. Government incentives really are the driving force behind our current energy policy, that is of primarily fossil fuel. And if we do want to move towards sustainability, it will necessitate the use of government in a role to move us that direction. That depending on that thesis that no matter how sincere our hope, that individual action is really unlikely to save the day. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. So what are some of the incentives that we should focus on and discuss? Central to the idea of reform, which is our topic, reform of law, reform of energy policy, is recognition that government must play a sustainable role in this area. In fact, this recognition of government role is really what drives environmental law in general. That we need a central system in order to implement any devices, any mechanisms protective of the environment. Why is that the case? Really, individual interest prevents people from acting alone to any benefit in this area. And thus, all of environmental law is really a reform on our basic structure of economic freedom. We have decided thus far that economic freedom cannot be unfettered, unrestricted, and environmental laws serve as a restraint on economic freedom. There's a new book out entitled The New Holy Wars, Economic Religion versus Environmental Religion. Very provocative and insightful to see how motivated and central those two causes, those two dynamics are in our world and often in conflict. So the complexity of cap and trade is now well established. Trying to implement and monitor such a system is somewhat overwhelming. That has moved many economists toward looking at a market approach. And in fact, for several years, I was convinced the market approach was the way to go. I think I revised that viewpoint, however, with the financial meltdown of a few years ago, because all of the problems that resulted in that financial catastrophe would really apply to a market-based approach to energy as well. So it's difficult to see the risks and the outcomes in that kind of market-based regulation. Moving us back to some kind of mutual coercion, mutually agreed to, and a new look back at the law. So what are the ways that we can address the problem? Well, one is to incentivize renewables. And in the US and elsewhere, there is advancement of this idea, both at the federal level and at the state level. And also taking away some of the incentives in traditional fossil fuel production. There are risks inherent, really, in all human enterprise, and renewable energy is not an exception to that. We've seen the debate on, really in every area here. In the area of wind, we've seen bird mortality and claims of concern about noise pollution, and concern of what the noise can do to people of particular susceptibilities. I think in the EU there was a concern of wind power and the noise created and the disruption that caused for an autistic child. So it's important to recognize that every renewable energy, just like every form of energy, carries risks with it. I include here both a reference to international efforts, which are still ongoing, have not borne the kind of change that we might have hoped for, and also the problem of the patchwork of regulations. In one of the panels this morning, one of our speakers talked about the need for systematic and comprehensive legislation in the environmental area. I think that's true in a subsidiary of the environmental area, which is the energy sector. To have a vast array, a patchwork, makes that very difficult for business and difficult for the NGO community that monitors business. And the difficulty isn't simply a matter of time, it's a matter of money as well for each industry to try to figure out what is compliance and how to come into compliance, especially when you have layers of government regulation. That's certainly true in the U.S. and I think true here to some extent as well. One other risk that has been the focus in both wind and solar has been a disruption of the visual landscape, and that's been a problem primarily with the major large wind developments, but also with solar and some other areas. So the U.S. experience, that's of course my area and interest. I'll note that now the area of standing in Massachusetts versus EPA, the U.S. Supreme Court did recognize standing of the state, Massachusetts and other states, to protect the citizens' health. We've come a long way in the environmental area in terms of standing, and not all of it has been good. Standing has arisen really within our lifetimes as a major barrier to enforcement of environmental rights. The theory now in the dissent, in this case, authored by Justice Scalia, is that no citizen should be allowed to enforce a right if that citizen's right is like every other's. And this is a theme that he has played out for many years, in fact, far before he went on the Supreme Court. That theory, that approach did not prevail in Massachusetts versus EPA, but it was simply a 5-4 decision. So it's an outstanding question whether or not that, that view of standing will persist. The idea there from Justice Scalia is that if you have a right that is undifferentiated from other people's rights, then the legislative path rather than the judicial path should be your way of protecting your rights. There's a problem with that, however, when the legislature has already spoken, has given the citizens a right to standing under a citizen suit provision. So to apply that theory to say, well, you don't have a right in court after the legislature has already spoken is, it seems to me, problematic. 10 minutes, okay. State and local efforts, this is really the flip side of the coin of the complexity that I just mentioned, and that is that people who wish to pursue their rights are not restricted to the federal avenue, that state and local law still has great importance. I mentioned that at the beginning with the Constitution of Montana, recognizing rights that the federal government does not recognize. Also here, in Europe as well as in the U.S., local efforts are of great importance. Land use planning boards have great power to say yes or no to particular developments. So one of our major laws, which has the concept has spread really worldwide, was passed in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act. In fact, the general idea was to protect the environment. Many people refer to the act as the National Environmental Protection Act. It actually is the Policy Act, created really simply to deal with government action of major federal government action. But many states do have a corollary state law. In Montana, it's MEPA, so we look at both NEPA and MEPA. And those state NEPAs also have significant power, although primarily procedural in nature. Environmental impact statement or environmental assessment, a shortened impact statement are required for federal action, whether it's permitting a coal plant or providing funding for research that could impact the environment. It is generally conceived of, however, not as a substantive right, but rather as a procedural right, a right to make sure that the agency has given a hard look to what will happen if the agency action goes forward. So the idea here was that before NEPA, agencies really did not have the power to look at environmental considerations. The Federal Highway Commission was to build highways, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was to make dams, and environmental considerations really did not come into the mix. So at this point, after many years, environmental considerations are firmly in the mix, but they don't necessarily drive the decision making. The skeptic might say, well, the agency now has to look at the action, see what will happen to the environment, but can go right ahead and take the action anyway. As I mentioned earlier, everything has risks and burdens attached. The big burden for NEPA is the delay that it causes, something that industrial sources and power producers often point to. This is maybe an overstatement. There's nothing to encourage the development of clean energy alternatives. Sounds a little bit like doom and gloom. I don't mean it that way. That's just beyond the scope of this act. The act does not have any power to say you should do something this way. Now, on the other hand, individual acts have streamlined NEPA, and primarily this is with regard to what's called unconventional fuels. They're exempted from the EIS process. Also, nuclear energy, to a great extent, is exempted from the EIS process. So in terms of a level playing field, NEPA has been streamlined. That drawback of cost and effort and time and delay is minimized when we have the streamlining. But so far, that streamlining has not been applied to renewables or other clean energy alternatives. Just as in European countries, the environmental impact statement must describe what the impacts will be, set forth possible alternatives, note the relationship of short-term and long-term benefits and costs, and note irreversible commitments. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but it doesn't dictate the decision-making. It simply sets up the record. And in a way, people say, well, what we've accomplished is that the political process will then take care of decisions that are obviously bad decisions. Of course, that takes knowledge and attention of the electorate to accomplish that. There are many ongoing sub-federal efforts. We have regional greenhouse gas solutions or attempted solutions, and one that has attracted a lot of attention is the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. And this has grown over the years. More state efforts I refer to here. I'm going to skip forward a little bit, including changes in land use at the local level and green technology development. This slide brings us back to the mayor's protection goals. Now, I think this is very admirable, and as of earlier this month, 1,060 mayors in the U.S. have signed on to this commitment to reduce the city's own greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, that is, stands as a good example, and state government and local government have many efforts to try to do this. it doesn't, of course, address the entire problem. It is somewhat aspirational. I have in here in the materials an example of Los Angeles. I chose that city because, of course, it was one of the worst air polluted cities of my youth, and it has come back a long way with its efforts. And we see effective governmental incentives in other countries. I give just random examples here of Brazil, Turkey, and Japan in individual sectors making fairly dramatic steps toward trying to address the problem. So renewable benefits, I've already noted that renewable energy, like every form of energy, has drawbacks. I've noted some of those as examples. There are, of course, benefits, the primary one being the implicit one of reduction of greenhouse gases. The other, which I don't name specifically here, I say geographically mobile. The wind blows most places for local use. Of course, the difficulty there is the transmission and the ability or inability to connect to the grid to make that usable. However, there is a good benefit to localized production and use, and that is, at least in the U.S., the fear of terrorism and disruption of the economy is made more pronounced by the widespread use of the grid. So more localized production could lower that risk as well. And I'm driving toward a conclusion here. I know my time is waning. Renewable subsidies. I have an error in this slide. This should be 2.4 billion out of 16 billion available, rather than 24 out of 16. This slide does recognize the attempts of government to look to renewable energy and try to incentivize renewable energy. So now here's the Pollyanna approach, and that's my provocative assertion that reform is inevitable. Brings me back to the precept of sustainability, that sustainability is necessary for human life. If we care about our grandchildren or even our children, intergenerational equity is something that speaks to each of us. And in order to ensure that sustainability, reform of energy is a necessity. So what's next? And this is the conversation stopper that I wanted to speak to briefly. What are the conversation stoppers? I'm sure you've heard them. The wind doesn't blow all the time. The sun doesn't shine all the time. Has anybody heard that? Anybody not heard that response to renewable energy? Well, what it says is we don't think we can tackle the storage problem. But there are storage problems relating to other energy sources as well. And historically, a much more optimistic approach to those. Because, of course, at the front end, we have problems with fossil fuels. Storage is a problem because shipper tanks leak or run aground, and that's a storage problem. Nuclear energy has a big storage problem. I think those in Ireland recognize that and have not relied on nuclear energy. But you do hear scientists and certainly proponents of nuclear energy say, well, don't worry, science will figure that out. We'll be able to store the waste from nuclear energy. So I'd like to see a little bit of the optimism about science applied to the storage issue of wind and solar. Because if science can help us on one hand, I think science can help us on the other hand as well. And I'll leave it there or allow our moderator chair to call for questions.